Wait a second. You're telling me Thelma and Louise is a Western?
Cowboys, Thelma and Louise has.
Wearing denim.
There's a lot of denim.
Find out next on Historians of the Movies podcast. Welcome to Historians of the Movies podcast. I'm your host, Jason Herbert, the creator of Historians of the Movies, the longest running watch party on the internet. Each week we're bringing you top scholars from around the world to talk about the movies we love and why they matter. And today I've got two people in front of you to talk about a movie we all love, and these two people I actually love. I've been following them for years. They are just the smartest people I can think of. I am such a big fan of them, the work that they bring to us. And I cannot wait to get into this today. So, Dr. Lauren MacIvor Thompson is a historian of early 20th century women's rights, medicine, law, and public health. She's an assistant professor of history and interdisciplinary studies at Kennesaw State University. And she also serves as a faculty fellow at Georgia State University College of Law's Center for Law, Health, and Society. She's got a book coming out soon. It's called Rivals and Rights. Mary Dennett, Margaret Sanger, and the Making of the American Birth Control Movement is forthcoming. And that's coming out through Rutgers University Press. Jacqueline Antonovich is a historian of health, medicine, and politics in the United States. She's an assistant professor in history at Muhlenberg College in Allentown, Pennsylvania, where she also directs the Shankweiler Scholars Medical Humanities Honors Program. She's currently working on a book with Rutgers University Press on women physicians and medical imperialism in the turn-of-the-century American West. Lauren, Jackie, thank you so much for being here today.
Oh my gosh, thanks for having us.
This is exciting.
Before I got into graduate school, I was like, wait, there's a history of medicine? Is there science involved? Is there math?
Jackie's the real historian of medicine. I'm the fake historian of medicine.
Oh, go on.
Because she has training in it. She actually has training.
I accidentally, it was really a subfield that I fell into accidentally, but I'm so happy that I did. I went to the University of Michigan for my PhD studies, and I initially went because I wanted to study the history of gender and women in the United States. But I sort of quickly fell into sort of a group of historians of medicine, and I fell in love with it very quickly. And so, now I study, I'm writing a book right now on the history of women physicians in the American West, and I sort of fell into that on accident as well, because I was studying this institution in Colorado for juvenile. It was an institution that was supposed to rehabilitate female juvenile delinquents. And I quickly found out that it was actually run by a lot of women physicians. And I thought that was really curious for an institution that was created in the late 19th century. And then I quickly found out that a lot of these women physicians were so involved in politics and public health in the American West, and in sometimes a lot of problematic ways. Many of them were very involved in the eugenics movement in the American West, anti-birth control advocacy, and even a few of them were involved members of the Ku Klux Klan in the 1920s. And so I often joke that I'm a historian of medicine who really doesn't write about medicine. I write about the intersection of politics, gender, race, and medicine.
So similar to Jackie, I also write about the medical politics, specifically birth control politics. And I went to Georgia State University, where I did not do a field in the history of medicine for my comps or anything like that. And I sort of figured out at the end of my dissertation that I was doing history of medicine or medical politics, and at any rate. But my dissertation looked at the relationship between suffrage and birth control. And then now my book is looking at what was my last chapter of the dissertation. So I'm looking at the relationship between this suffragist named Mary Ware Dennett and Margaret Sanger, the birth control reformer, who most of you probably know. And I'm looking at how their relationship, very antagonistic relationship, and the choices that they made in the teens and 20s in New York as the birth control movement was beginning to kind of take off. I'm looking at how that shaped for the rest of the decade access to birth control and the legalization of birth control. So there were a lot of moments along the way where things I think could have gone differently, and not that historians deal that much in counterfactuals, but it's interesting to look at these moments in the teens and 20s where things could have gone differently, and they didn't for a variety of reasons. So the book is exploring that. And Jackie and I are publishing in the same press, in the same series, which is very exciting. So we're book twins. Yay.
Do I have to ask the whole who is Thelma and who is Louise in this thing? Because
oh my gosh,
have we thought about this at all?
I was thinking about this, Jackie. We are both Louise.
Yeah. It's so funny that you asked this question.
Are we Louise and Louise?
We are both
Jason,
Louise,
that means you're Thelma. You're Thelma.
I've been called worse.
Yeah.
I like Thelma. She's
That's
great.
great.
I love Thelma.
We'll talk about Thelma later. But yeah, go on.
Can I just say that when I was watching this movie, I thought, like, okay, this movie came out in 1991. And I have to tell you, like, you know, in all transparency, 1991 is the year I graduated from high school. So this movie is sort of very foundational to my young adult thinking. But when I first watched this movie, when I was 18 years old, I really identified with Thelma. I thought I was a Thelma. And now watching this movie 31 years later, I realized, nope, I'm definitely a Louise, right?
It's the packing, when she was packing in the beginning of the film, when she puts all the clothes in the bag. I was like, oh, I do that. Also, I kind of identified, and we can get into this obviously, but I sort of identified with like the extremely deep-seated rage that suddenly pops out at like a not a great moment, which I think is such a seminal moment in the film. And I'm a little bit, you know, I'm younger than Jackie. I was 11 when this film came out. So I actually didn't come to this until well after like the zeitgeist of Thelma and Louise like was over. And so I watched it, I don't know, I think maybe before I went to graduate school. And so it did not have, and then I rewatched it this weekend to prepare for hopping on here to do this discussion. And I was like, wow, I didn't remember picking up on a lot of the things that I picked up on this past weekend. So I had a lot of thoughts about the film as I was watching. And it was, it was an interesting experience to see it as a historian of women and gender.
But it also occurs to me, though, the fact that I think watching it as an 18-year-old and now, you know, as a, 40-something-year-old, that, you know, identifying once as Thelma and now more as Louise is really sort of indicative of like, you know, sort of the full spectrum. Well, I want to say full spectrum, but certainly like, I mean, I think it's significant that Thelma sort of represents sort of this younger, more naive character, whereas Louise represents this more hardened by life sort of character. So it's easy to identify with Louise from a certain standpoint versus, you know, growing older and having seen some of the world and sort of being able to identify with Louise a little bit more.
Yeah, you know, it's interesting because I'm actually hearing both of you talk. Like, I was 14 when this film came out, so right between the two of you, and I'm a guy, right? And I have no interest in watching a girl movie, you know, in high school, right? This, you know, little I know, like, I don't quite appreciate Ridley Scott. I certainly don't appreciate this film, you know, as a 14-year-old boy, the way I do now. And I was, you know, watching this film and I'd seen bits and pieces of it. I don't know that I've ever actually sat down and watched the whole thing continuously before. And you're absolutely right, because now I'm older than Louise. I think when Susan Sarandon is filming this, she's 44. I think Gina Davis is 34 when they were filming this in 1990. So at 45, I've passed both of them, and I do think that like that has a certain the lived experiences that the three of us have all had will shape the way that we go back and watch this film, and also the way we think about our memories of this film from the first times that we saw it and so forth, right? Because I go back and watch it, I'm like, oh, it's a girl movie. I don't want no girls, right? And so forth, right? Oh, also, I do want to bring up one thing. We were just saying that you're both Louise and therefore I am Thelma. I just want to say that I'm hurt deeply that nobody wants to say I'm Brad Pitt. We will talk about this later on, this slight that I'm hurting. But let me ask you this. When I came to you both I said, hey, any film you want to watch, what do you think would be awesome? You were both like, Thelma and Louise. Why Thelma and Louise?
I think it was actually my idea, and I sort of twisted Lauren's arm into watching, although I don't think I had to twist it very much. You were pretty game to go. And I think
I was like, I'll do that.
Yeah. And I think to start out, when I suggested the film, Jason, I thought I wanted to talk mostly about the fact, because I'm teaching the history of the American West this semester, and it was sort of on my mind because many times when I teach this class, I give an assignment where I ask students to watch a Western and write sort of a critical analysis on the film based on some of the themes that we've been exploring in class. And I offer usually a list of Westerns, and I include, very traditional Westerns, older 1950s Westerns, all the way up into the present day. But then, I'll also include some films that maybe haven't considered a Western. And, first and foremost on that list is Thelma and Louise. And so I really imagined talking about it as a Western and why I firmly believe it's a Western.
We should absolutely talk about it as a Western.
Yes, we should. Although now that I've watched it again, I have so many other thoughts about it as a historical piece of 1990s feminism that I think is also really important to talk about. But I guess the question that I ask you, if we're sort of going to talk about the Western aspect first, I'm going to ask this question to both of you. So what do you think, what would be your one word answers to what are the components of a Western? What does a Western have to have in it to be considered a Western?
Oh, man.
So we can start off with cowboys.
Yeah, I was going to say jeans.
Denim. Okay. So cowboys.
Yeah, denim.
Cowboys, Thelma and Louise has.
Wearing denim.
There's a lot of denim in Thelma and Louise.
Again, doesn't look anything like Jason, as we've already established. It's awesome.
Okay.
That's great.
Okay, what else?
A chase.
Yeah.
It's got to have a chase.
It's got to have a chase, right? Which Thelma and Louise has.
As you're talking about this, it's making me think that Ridley Scott really frames a lot, especially that last third of the film, a lot like John Ford would film these big Westerns. And I hadn't even thought about that till it brought this up I hadn't even thought about this one as a Western. And then you said, it was like, oh yeah, duh. Dust. Uh-huh. It's got to be in the West.
It's got to be in the West. You have to have the grand Western landscape, right? You have to have the big panorama of the Western landscape. And I think Thelma and Louise was shot largely in Utah, right? And so you get the the arches and, all of these really sort of grand Arizona desert scenery with the dust, which I think is also important.
What I think is interesting, though, is and Hell or High Water does this too, which I think is the best Western I've seen recently. You don't have, say, cowboy. I mean, Hell or High Water does actually have that cowboy scene where he's moving the cattle. Right. But in place of that, say in Thelma and Louise, what you have now in the West are these stand-ins of oil derricks in place of cattle. Right. I mean, that's kind of been the new movement of what the West is in a lot of ways. And, they have that side trip where they're cruising around those oil derricks. And that seems to be the West in the early 1990s.
Oh, that's such a good point. I didn't even think about that. I was thinking, when I was thinking cowboys, I was first of all mostly thinking of that cowboy bar that they go into, right? Which is supposedly in Arkansas, right? But, still sort of very big on sort of cowboy culture. But then there's that other scene at the very end where they're sort of, the law is sort of closing in on them and they get caught up in that cattle drive, which I think is just an amazing scene where they're trying to get the big orange or big green car through there, right?
Yeah.
You also have bad guys, outlaws, right? That makes a Western, which is certainly what Thelma and Louise are. And you usually have shootouts.
Yep.
Right?
I was going to say that next. The shootouts, guns.
Yep.
We've
got that.
Western. Yeah.
There's an interesting twist through here because you've got Harvey Keitel as the good sheriff, right? We're sympathizing with Thelma and Louise, obviously, right? And I kept watching this thinking about representation of men. Men don't really come off well in a lot of this movie. We talk all about both Thelma's husband, Christopher McDonald, Louise's paramour, who is likable but also violent. We see there's that moment where he starts to smash some stuff in the room. He comes in, you're like, oh, okay, there's some color to this guy's story here, right? But Harvey Keitel is you're actively rooting for this guy, I think, and maybe that's there's a story there too as far as his role as if we're going to look at this as the West, what does he represent? Is he the noble lawman?
I thought about that too. I mean, he obviously, when he says to Louise, I know what happened to you in Texas. And at first because I had basically was watching this with fresh eyes, I was like, oh, is he trying to, weaponize that against her? Is he using this against her? And then like at the end, I was like, oh, he was sympathetic. That's why he wanted to help, And so, yeah, I mean, I think he does kind of represent, he's the one man in the film that is, at least carries some like moral, well, I don't know. I guess Louise's ex-boyfriend, he also is a bit
Michael Madsen.
Half and half. Yes.
I'm going to push back on the Michael Madsen thing because I actually think that he turns out to be a very bad guy, right? Because he gives her up at the end. He tells the cops everything about giving them money, about where he ran into them, right?
Also, the giving of the engagement ring, like traditionally, I think we're supposed to be like, oh, yay, like he wants to marry her. And I think Susan Sarandon's character does a very good job of kind of portraying like, actually, this is like not really, this is a trap. This is not good for me. I shouldn't take this ring. He does. And then he says, take it and keep it. But, there is this moment where it's like he's trying to like capture her and hold on to her. And she's like, no.
And to compare that to Harvey Keitel's character, Harvey Keitel is the good guy in this film. Maybe we could call him the white hat, I guess, if we're going to go with that Western metaphor. He's the only character that listens, that hears Thelma and Louise, that sees them for human beings and is listening to what their problems are, or what's going on with them versus, Louise's boyfriend is not listening. Like if he had been listening to her, he wouldn't have given her that ring, right? Because that is not what she was saying. And of course, Thelma's husband obviously is not listening to her at all, right? So Harvey Keitel's character is the only character that is actually sort of seeing the situation for what it is.
Yeah, but men in this film in general, somebody mentioned on Twitter that just the oppression follows them everywhere. They can't get away from. There's other women in the film, like the woman that they encounter at the bar in the first kind of pivotal scene. And she seems to be some sort of ally, but then once the two characters are off driving out west, I mean, they're it. And then they're just surrounded by these men who want to hurt them, catch them, arrest all these things. And so somebody mentioned that the loud truck sounds out west when the other cars or trucks are driving by kind of are a stand-in for male aggression, and they literally they're driving as far west as they can go to escape it, and they just can't escape it. And I thought that was a really profound comment, so thank you to whoever that was on Twitter, because I thought that was really good. But yeah, I mean, men in this film are not good. And this is a film about two women who are forced to make choices because of the kind of world that men force them to live in. I mean, I was thinking about this a lot. I was like, this is a film about the choices women have to make because rape exists. What kind of world, you couldn't have a Thelma and Louise without the rapes that happened to them. So in many ways, it's kind of a very blunt instrument, that kind of like late 80s, early 90s feminism that brought us Margaret Atwood's The Handmaid's Tale. This is a time where obviously there's increasing conservatism. So there's a big backlash against feminism. And so I think that the writer, Callie, is it Corey or Cowrie? I'm not sure how you pronounce her name, but, in some ways the film is like, it's very in front of our faces about that, but it's also this very subtle commentary at the same time. So it really does a lot of interesting things at the same time about sexual violence and women's reactions to it and the kinds of choices that they have to make because they live in that world.
I'm really glad to hear you sort of situating the film, in the time period that it was made, Lauren, because I kept thinking about that as well. And again, getting back to like, oh, this film came out when I graduated high school, but like thinking about 1991 and like what a transitionary moment of feminism this was in the United States, right? So like we're sort of like in between, I don't know, like 1980s working girl Melanie Griffith, like I can do it all feminism, right? Like big shoulder pads and like high hair, right? Feminism into like 90s feminism, which, when I think about, it's like third wave feminism, Riot Girls, like sort of more of a
Lilith Fair.
Yes. And,
Very much
and it's
so.
like Thelma and Louise comes right in between this moment. And not only that, if you think about like what was happening in 90, 91, 92, 1991 was the year that Anita Hill testified against Clarence Thomas.
Yes. And when Louise says to Thelma, nobody will believe us. I mean, what a moment. And what I think that was a moment. I mean, I don't know. I was 11, so I don't know. But I feel like if I had been watching it in the theater and had been at all politically aware, I would have picked up on that phrase, that sentence, like, wow. And we're watching this from a post like #MeToo perspective, but I was just, so, I mean, in many ways, like our world is very different because we do live in a world where Harvey Weinstein has gone to jail. Other men have gone to jail because of the kinds of things that they did. And, so in some ways, like, I think that we can see some progress or movement forward, if you will, from 1991. And yet, as historians, we know that we don't live in a progress narrative, and any kind of historical work that tries to couch it as a progress narrative it's not treating it with enough nuance. And so I think, in another 20 years, when we watch Thelma and Louise, like how will we then, I mean, I think we're at a moment now, I think we passed the moment of progress, and now we're at this moment where we're receding, where we're actually like shifting backwards. And history is like that, push pull. There's never just this forward teleological path. So we're watching it at a very interesting moment. I think maybe if we had watched it in 2019, we might be saying something very different than what we're saying right now about the film.
I think that moment that you brought up, Lauren, about that conversation that Thelma and Louise have, where she says, no one would have believed me. And then Louise starts going over all of the reasons why, right? That, Thelma was drunk. She was dancing with Harlan. She went outside with him voluntarily, right? Like all of these things, she was asking for it, basically, right? And that's sort of what they say. And it's frustrating how much of a familiar narrative that this still is, right? And it makes me think of all of these conversations that we've had in just the past few years. And I'm thinking about, things like, Trump's famous, Access Hollywood tape, right? Or, like you mentioned, Harvey Weinstein, or just even the Me Too movement. And if we think about like what exactly, we call it the #MeToo movement, but like if we think about like what was actually going on and behind that hashtag, which I know was not the first time that, that hashtag was used, but like it was when women were going on social media and talking about Me Too. This happened to me too, right? And
Yep.
It's just frustrating that a movie like this, for like all of the attention that it got when it came out, that it didn't, that we're still having these conversations. And I think that's what makes Thelma and Louise actually hold up pretty well as a film.
It is a classic that I think, because until we get rid of our Constitution and find something better, which, that is a pipe dream, obviously, at the moment, until we pass the Equal Rights Amendment, say, that comment about no one will believe us because the evidence says otherwise, like they don't believe women in court, right? That's the implication of what she's saying. I mean, we know that the law and women's status has never, women were invisible in the law in the 18th and 19th centuries. The Constitution only says the word sex one time, and it's in the 19th Amendment. And that is not even a positive right to vote, as we know. It's just simply saying that states cannot make laws that abridge voting based on sex. That's not really a positive right to vote. And then, of course, women don't exist legally in the Constitution except through the auspices of the 14th Amendment. And thanks to Ruth Bader Ginsburg and her interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, we enjoy most of the rights that we have today because of that. And you know, again, we have seen some progress in 1991, for example. Many of the gender equality cases hadn't even finished winding their way through the Supreme Court like they did in the mid to late 90s or even early 2000s. But as we know, as the Dobbs case showed us in June, women still do not really exist in the law, in the American law as it is. And so that phrase that she says is just a microcosm. And again, something that is a continuity. And that's kind of another thing I was thinking of, you know, if history is not a progress narrative, it's a series of continuities more than it is serious breaks that in those continuities that completely transform and shift everything. So in some ways, that progress is not the same thing as continuity, though.
Jackie, you had said that this film is really, you know, it holds up because of because what we've just been talking about. And I think, Lauren, you're absolutely right. I think the "they'll never believe us" line is the single most important line in the entire film. It really kind of sets off the entire movie right after what happens. So I'm kind of wondering if we think about this in terms of like 1991, and we think and we kind of all agree that, you know, these situations still happen. What happens if we move this movie forward in time, say 30 years? Is this movie remarkably different? I mean, what's different in this film if we move it from, say, 91 to 2021 or 2022?
Oh, that's such a good question. And I was actually thinking about that. Sorry, Jackie, I didn't mean to jump in front of you. But one thing I was thinking of was just like the sheer logistics in the film, like with the phone calls and the car and things like that. Like, you could not make Thelma and Louise set in 2022 because we have cell phones and cars have GPS, and they could not do necessarily what they did. And I mean, they were on the lam in the film for several days a week. I mean, I feel like it would just be a fundamentally different film because of technology. And the filmmakers would have to do some really interesting creative things to like get around, like to make it more believable and plausible. But it's quite plausible in 1991 that somebody could do those things and get away with it for a week.
It's such a good point, Lauren, because I was actually thinking the exact same thing. Great minds think alike, right? Because there's this moment where they're deep in the rural American West, and they're interacting with a lot of people, even though they're in this, you know, very small area. You know, like there's that one scene that I love so much where Louise sits down next to that old man, and she takes off her watch and her earrings, and she hands them to him so that she gets her hat, you know, his hat in return. And she has all of these sort of transactional sort of moments with these people, and they seem to have absolutely no clue that these two women are wanted for murder. And you're right that in this day and age, I don't think that would be able to happen, right? That even folks in, you know, I used to live in the very rural American West town, and, you know, we knew what was going on. We had internet, right? And so I think the technological aspect is really interesting. But I also think that sort of trying to think of other ways to answer this question, because I'm trying to think if there's been there's a lot of films out there, especially nowadays, that have like the strong woman character, right? Or the sort of lean in feminism. It's a very common trope now in movies, right? Whether it's like a superhero, right? Like a Marvel superhero, or it's some woman who's just totally kicking ass on screen. But again, those films are largely this sort of like kick-ass feminism that doesn't sort of have the tragedy that's involved in Thelma and Louise, right? Where, you know, Lauren mentioned before, yes, these women are kicking ass, they're shooting guns, they're, you know, I mean, who doesn't love that scene of the truck driver? I mean, who doesn't love that? That is the most amazing scene ever.
What woman has not wanted, I think just very quickly to insert this, I mean, like Thelma and Louise's reactions and the words that come out of their mouths and the things that they say to the men that they are basically getting revenge on. I mean, all women dream of being able to say and do those things. And most of us cannot and do not, right? But Thelma and Louise put into film, into action, into something that we can see the kinds of things that women think about in reaction to the kinds of things that men say and do to them. And so that part to me is really remarkable. But yeah, like they are in the end, it's not that I can't decide. Are they punished for that? And that's why the movie has to end the way it does in 1991. Whereas in 2022, I think Thelma and Louise would be like walk scot-free, like they'd do something awesome at the end. They'd still be alive. Like that would be the 2022 Thelma and Louise. But in 1991, like, again, if we're looking at this movie as like a framework, a visual story, a narrative of how women, the kinds of choices that women have to make because of what men say and do to them, there's not real. Maybe they're right that when the two women look at each other at the end and they're like, it's going to really suck if we go back. Like they're like, what's back? What's at home for us? Nothing. So let's keep going. And then they just shoot off the cliff. I mean, there's so much packed into that scene. I mean, so many things ran through my head when I was watching that. I was like, is this because they did the thing where they're two women out in public and riding around by themselves in a man's world and you can't do that? And for that, the punishment is death? Or are they subverting a standard ending? I mean, I read that Susan Sarandon fought really hard to keep that ending. And I would love to know more about why she fought so hard and why Ridley Scott maybe wanted to change it and what he wanted to change it to.
I have so many thoughts about that ending, Lauren. Like, on one hand, I am really, I don't know, maybe this says something more about me and my sort of perspective, little dark, but I'm so glad that they kept the ending. I'm glad that Susan Sarandon kept that ending. It feels like the right ending. But I wonder what went into the choices post-production. I really sort of struggle with how the film just fades into white and then it plays this really happy song that shows them as they were young and when they first like went on the trip and the postcard. It's very jarring, right? Like that they go from going off the cliff to this sort of like jaunty, happy song. I think that's what I don't know. I mean, like, I struggle with the way I like the ending, but I don't like the ending. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, they're not the kick-ass 2022, like superhero feminist that we would see now. What I do think is a continuity into the kinds of films that have women at the center of them in 2022. I think Thelma and Louise is one of the only films from this period where really the central relationship is Thelma and Louise, right? The central relationship is not with these men that they're married to or having sex with or whatever. The central relationship is them. And I think that in today's films, we see that repeated now. Like I think about, I thought about the Ghostbusters film, the all women one. I mean, the story there is the friendship between the women, right? It has nothing to do with any of the men that sort of orbit around them. They're there for comic relief, basically, right? And so I think there were films that came before that had two women at the center, but I think so much more often antagonistically. And this is one of the first films that we see where, because it's a Western, it's a buddy film, it's a buddy heist film, right? But like there's so much more going on there because it was showing women with the deepest kind of friendship, literally to the death, literally defending each other to the death. And that I think is also very profound. And it paved the way for the kinds of films that we see today. You know, I can't think of any off the top of my head except for like Little Women. And but
it definitely passes the Bechdel test, right?
Yes, exactly.
You know, Lauren, as you're talking, like the movie that popped in my head as you just said that was Butch and Sundance. Right? These two people who, don't survive the film. The film ends, spoiler alert for those of you who haven't seen a 50-year-old film, right? But with those two guys going out in a hail of gunfire But you get a sense that in doing so, they kind of found that freedom that they were always looking for themselves. And the thing that I kept thinking about watching this film was how oppressed both women were, kind of trapped into the doldrums, their relationships, their work life. And so, in that last scene, which I think is actually one of the best end scenes I think I've ever seen, right? And we've seen it parodied a bunch. I think Wayne's World did a parody of it. I think the only way to I actually liked the flashback to them taking a selfie.
Oh yeah, I did think about that when that scene. It's like selfie.
Because that was when they found the freedom, which was with one another. I mean, that was the only thing I could kind of come up to was in death, they found that freedom. And quite literally, the freedom was getting away from the rest of the men. There wasn't another woman in sight on that last that last thing, which is Harvey Keitel's kind of running with his hand out. That was the only thing I could really think about. I also really applaud Sarandon's ability to keep that ending, because maybe you make that film in 2022 and they get away and there's some kind of justice, but I think that that makes it a weaker film. Mm-hmm. This is not a film about justice.
It's a commentary on, again, what women have to do or think that they have to do in order to survive.
And right, Lauren, if these two women could have come out on top of the situation, it would mean that this was an individual problem to be solved. But what I think Thelma and Louise is sort of tackling here is this more sort of systemic nature of the patriarchy 1990s version, right? Like there is no sort of individual, I'm going to kick ass out of this situation, right? Because there's just not.
Another film that's made right around this time, I think, is The Joy Luck Club, which I also thought about that film because of the women character. I mean, talk about the Bechdel test, and it's about 4 mothers and 4 daughters, and the central relationships of those films, again, are not their relationships necessarily with their husbands or boyfriends or whatever, fathers. It's the mother-daughter relationship and the bond. And so, I mean, it's a very interesting moment in the early 90s then to be making these films that have these, at the time, at a time when obviously we're still living in, 1991, I don't think is that functionally different than 1981, 1971. I mean, there's some things obviously by the 90s have shifted, but it's still, because of 1991 is a very specific moment, right? As you mentioned, Jackie, in the beginning, where it's in between these things. And so, but at the same time, the film industry and these directors, female directors and writers are starting to hone in on what it means to have, for women to have relationships and what the kinds of things that those relationships do for them and the protection that they find within those relationships. Because I think the messaging in films like Thelma and Louise or The Joy Luck Club, or even Ghostbusters, like in whenever that was, 18, the messaging is women can't rely on men to do the right thing or protect, women have to protect each other. I think that's sort of the sense I'm getting. And again, that's, I think, coming out of a very specific moment in 90s feminism. And yet the kinds of films that we see today that have women at the center are echoing those same themes in some ways.
So speaking of 90s feminism, and again, the fact that I saw this as a senior in high school, can I just throw out the fact that I didn't know as a high schooler or an 18-year-old what the female gaze was, but
yeah.
I think we all know that, I think I became very aware, just sort of on a very physical level, what the female gaze was when Brad Pitt comes on the screen, right? I actually can't remember a movie. I think that might be the first movie that I ever saw that it seems like that Brad Pitt is purely on the screen for the female gaze.
And it subverts the Western, right? Because in the Westerns, it's always the pretty girl, the hot girl,
Oh, that's
and
good
then
take, yeah.
Brad Pitt is the hot girl.
Yeah.
In this.
Well, we talk about the historical implications of this film. This movie gives us Brad Pitt.
Yes.
Yeah.
And it's
Incredible.
It's definitely Susan Sarandon and Gina Davis's film, unquestionably. I think Gina Davis is phenomenal in this movie. I could not take I watched it with fresh eyes yesterday. It was stunningly just in love with Gina Davis in 1991. Just my goodness.
And then she goes on to be in A League of Their Own, right? So
Oh yeah.
talk about more women in film, like go early 90s. Like
Yeah, exactly.
There's a minute there.
But if this film doesn't come out, we don't get Brad Pitt, or we might not get Brad Pitt, who I think, this is one of my hot takes, is maybe one of the 5 best actors of his generation. I think that you're talking about the female gaze, which I can't exclaim on, except for I can just, I get a lot of comments, people saying, Jason, you do remind me of Brad Pitt. I mean, people not on this call haven't said it, but that's cool. I think in a lot of ways, the man is so handsome that it's easy to overlook his talent.
Yeah. I mean, you forget that, well, in watching it now, we know he's Brad Pitt. At the time, audiences didn't know they were like, who's this?
Just
he's
some guy.
Good looking, But also, I mean, he plays a very functionalist role in the film. I mean, he's there to give Gina Davis the kinds of experiences in terms of a relationship. It's like for 3 hours or whatever. But, he's there to show her, and they even talk about this afterward, right? Like, I finally understand what all the fuss is about, because she, reveals to the audience that she has been with the husband, whose name is escaping me, since she was 14, and they got married when she was 18. I mean, she was a child, and so she lives a lot in the like 24 hours that they encounter Brad Pitt's character, and by the time he leaves with the money, that's a lot packed into that day.
Yeah, and I actually want to give a little bit of credit to the filmmakers. I mean, obviously, you just look at Brad Pitt, especially like, the very first movie, Brad Pitt, I don't know if this was his very first movie, but I think the first time, most of us became aware of him. And it's not hard to make him look pretty, right? But like, there's something about the dialogue, there's something about the way that they shoot him, right? The way they film him, that very much is intended to make women swoon. And I think that that's more like you said, Lauren, I think it's more subversive than we may think, right? Like, there are handsome men on movies all the time. Like, you don't usually become a leading man unless you're handsome, right? But there's just a way that they filmed this, that this was for sort of like, if you're attracted to men, this is the gaze for you, right? Like this, it's just the way they filmed it was very, very intentional, I think.
There's a reciprocity between Brad Pitt and the camera. I think we could just agree, right? And I cannot get out of my head, Lauren, what you said earlier about how this is the inverse relationship. Brad Pitt's abs become the long legs of the woman in El Paso from the Marty Robbins song,
And he's he's a well-developed character too. Like, I mean, that's the other thing that kind of subverts the narrative, right? Because a lot of times in those old Westerns, like the woman, the one woman in the film is this very kind of like flat, two-dimensional character that's just there to be rescued or whatever it is. And here, I mean, he's both good. We love him because he's pretty and he's nice to Gina Davis, and we want somebody to be nice to her after everything she's been through with all these awful men. And then, of course, he steals the money. So then you're like, like he's in a way the catalyst for what goes on to happen to them afterward. But he's also like, she's having fun because once the money gets stolen, she's like, I'm going to hold up a convenience store. And she's like, I'm really good at this. I like this. This is fun. And she's like, I'm finally having fun. And so there's all kinds of things happening on so many levels there. With the relation, that very brief relationship just like wakes her up. And in a way, we kind of see her grow into an adult. The further out west these two women go, the more free they become. We can see them acting more freely. They're, in the moments of happiness, they're intensely happy. And then we really see her, she takes it like especially when Susan Sarandon or Louise falls apart, Gina Davis and as Thelma is there to pick her up. And it's because she's had this, I guess, sexual experience. And so in a way, like, it's a little bit like they're using sex and rape as like these central things that like completely push the narrative of all of the entire film. And so we can talk about that. Is that when can we have a film like Thelma and Louise where it's like not because of sex and rape that all these things happen, but at the same time, it makes sense in the context of the story that we're presented with.
Are you guys familiar at all with some of the backlash that this film had once it was released?
No.
I looked up a little bit because I was curious. I heard that a lot of critics were like very scornful initially of the film because they were like, oh, these two women are just acting like men.
Mm-hmm.
And are we just like, is this feminism? Like where they just go around and act like men and commit immoral acts, like very dismissive.
Yeah, I think there was a Time magazine critic very famously called the film toxic feminism. And I think, they said, I think another critic said that it was that all of the men characters are caricatures, basically, which I think is sort of funny because that's often how women are sketched out in some of these films, right? And I think another one said that it was just a man-hating revenge story of feminism gone too far, which I think is really interesting because I think this movie would be a wonderful film to actually teach. And I can't believe that I'm saying this because I feel like this was just yesterday, but like thinking about now how we're more and more, in more history courses and we're teaching sort of like modern US history and thinking about the 90s, I think Thelma and Louise really works as a perfect film to talk about feminism in the 90s, both the ways in which it was manifesting in pop cultures like films like Thelma and Louise, but also the backlash that it was getting.
Yeah. And we know that backlash didn't end afterwards either. That's what's so, insert the word here, frustrating, interesting, predictable. We know that all kinds of films that have women at the center now are still getting pushback. And I'm thinking about that Jennifer Lopez movie where the husband is abusive and she like trains and trains and trains in martial arts.
I think it's called.
Yes, Enough. And like, I remember reading, I watched that movie, I think in high school or college. And I remember reading a review of it where the reviewer said, all she is immoral at the end because she kills the guy like when he's down. Right. And I remember thinking, well, if she didn't kill him, he was going to come back. I mean, the cycle would repeat. So what choice did she have? I remember thinking like, I don't agree with this take at all. Of course, I think it was a male reviewer who wrote that. And so, yeah, we just see that continuously from the mouths of reviewers where women are making choices about what they're going to do to somebody that hurt them. And we see them characterized over and over again as immoral. Oh, that's just like feminism gone run amok.
I think one other critic also said that I think a few other critics said that it was just gratuitously violent. Mm-hmm. How many deaths happened in this film? Let's just think how many, I know how many people died in Die Hard versus how many people die in Thelma and Louise. But we don't really hear that.
Right. We have 3 on-screen deaths if we count Thelma and Louise, right?
Yeah. I was going to say it's 3. It's the rapist and the 2 women.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Do you think that this film the ending would be different or the trajectory of the film would be different if there were children?
I was going to ask that, Lauren. I'm so mad that you asked me before that because I actually have it on my notes.
Is it my notes?
Yes. I'm so mad at you, Lauren. I actually have it. I have it on my notes down here at the bottom. I says questions. No kids? ? Because we know this film, it had to have been a deliberate choice that neither Thelma or Louise had children. Because how would this film look different?
They can die because they aren't mothers.
Yeah. Oh, that's such a great question. All right. So let's have you, I'm putting my hat on backwards. So I'm thinking, what do you think? Answer your own question. How does this movie change? Are we talking about in 2022 or are we talking about 1991?
I'll go first, Lauren, because I've been thinking about this all day. I don't think that in 1991 or 2022, this film would be made if there were children involved. Because Thelma and Louise are meant to be the heroes, sort of like, of the film. And mothers, historically and in present day, have to be selfless. And no good mother would... Well, we could go through the whole movie. Like nothing that Thelma and Louise do would be reflective of good motherhood in this society. They wouldn't be going away for the weekend. camping, right? Unless they were taking the kids with them. They certainly wouldn't be going out to the bar and dancing with strange men or drinking. It would just change the calculus of the whole thing. Oh, I don't know. What do you have to say, Lauren? Because I'm still sort of working through all my thoughts here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I'm like you. I had a lot of sort of like conflicting, weird, unfinished thoughts about it. But I wrote down they can die because they aren't mothers.
Yes.
Like I wrote that. That's like why the ending could be the ending that it is, because they aren't mothers, and it really is a shame because I don't think we have any films on this caliber. I mean, maybe I don't go to the movies enough, but you all tell me. Like, I feel like there's not any like deeply complex films about motherhood that have been made in the last 20, 30 years. I don't know. Because think about the stories, like the bad mothers are people like Casey Anthony and like Susan Smith who drown, people who kill their kids, drown their kids, whatever. Like we have those stories in the media and they're not complicated at all, really. And do we have any films?
And can you have sympathy? Can you have sympathy for a mother who is struggling with things that have nothing to do with motherhood, right? Like if she doesn't selflessly give herself up for her children, can we have sympathy for her?
Right.
So what you're saying then is the lesson to be taken from this film is women have children in the home and that will save your lives.
Yes, basically.
Just in case you're listening, I am completely joking here. So
yeah, because they wouldn't have done any of this.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think like you could have I don't think an audience would accept like mothers, quote unquote, abandoning their children. Because the first, and certainly it's not like the women left with the idea over the weekend. Like they were coming home after the weekend was over, right? And then everything just kind of spiraled out, out of control.
I just think it's interesting that we're both parents. And so I think it's something that we both naturally thought of, right? We're both mothers. Yeah.
I wonder, you brought up this great question about like wrestling with motherhood and things like that. And I don't even know like films that I would think of. The only thing that maybe came to mind was A Marriage Story, which I haven't seen. I have trouble watching that kind of film. So I don't even know like these films that would really, it seems like it's such a great avenue to explore the human condition, to talk about like what motherhood is or fatherhood is. And I think we've seen a lot of fatherhood films, but I don't know the motherhood films. And like to put in these questions about like, what do you do when you're in a bad situation? Because both of these are in loveless, certainly Thelma is definitely in a loveless relationship. I think Louise is in a really complicated, affectionate, abusive relationship of some level. Boy, I don't know.
And any of these things that happened to Thelma and Louise could have happened to them and they still could have been mothers, right? Like they could have gone out together for a night out on, away from the kids, and all of those things could have still happened. But would we be able to tell that story either as part of their identities as being mothers or not? Like, I'm not sure. It's a complicated question. It's a much more simple, clean line to make Thelma and Louise as women who don't have children, then it would just be too messy, I think.
And the films where we do see mothers sort of like kick-ass feminism, these are mothers who are doing it all. Like they fight bad guys by night and are baking cookies by day. Like they're doing it all, and we still haven't gotten away from that trope. So a lot of the films that have women at the center that are made by women, directed by women, for women audiences, like I feel like a lot of times they just kind of like skip over the kids issue because like nobody can figure out how to grapple with this. So
I want to ask you about music.
Oh, because this is a Hans Zimmer soundtrack.
Well, it's a Hans Zimmer soundtrack, right? But I was listening to like just the songs and thinking about like who was I thinking about musically as I was watching this film. Because a lot of the voices I wasn't familiar with. I could have sworn I'd heard KT Oslin. I checked the soundtrack like 3 times to make sure that I was wrong. I'm just kind of wondering, because it was, I think there was a cover of Van Morrison, I want to say, in this film. Like, were you thinking about the music at all? Did this appeal to you? I mean, because you both brought up this idea of like, this is a forerunner to a lot of the musical revolutions that are happening 2-3 years from and really kind of getting up and going, Lilith there, notably, right? So I'm wondering, did this have an effect on music at the time? If this was like a woman's empowerment movement, that kind of, movie that changed music as well.
Yeah, it's interesting. Like they sing a lot of kind of like when they're singing like fun kind of like 60s. Well, actually, your question made me think about race in the film because obviously it's like a very white centric film, two white women. There's like one black character that comes along in a very like memorable scene where the cop is locked in the trunk and the guy on the bicycle blows like marijuana smoke into the air hole of the car where they've locked him in there, and there are like people of color in the background. Like I think in one scene you can see what looks like a Native American group or family like in the background, but like the only other time that I think people of color appear in the film is in the music. So it's like a very interesting juxtaposition because I don't know, it's like they're visually there and they're kind of there in the background. And obviously like the scene with the guy on the bicycle is like this like commentary about, I mean, even then it was like a commentary on race and the cops, right? Like this is when Rodney King is 2 years later.
I think, I want to get back to the music question, but I do want to, expand on that. But I also sort of had the same thoughts for a film, which is that's supposed to go from Arkansas to the Grand Canyon, right? So you're going through the Deep South, you're going through, well, not Texas. We know we're going around Texas, but like Oklahoma, into Arizona. It is a shockingly white film, white film, right? Like there is that one black character that's brought in almost as, well, maybe a commentary on the cops, but also sort of for like comedic relief, right? Just,
yeah. Right.
And then, going through Arizona, Oklahoma, you maybe see occasionally a very quick flash of a Native American or Mexican, person in the background. It's almost like just watching this from a 2022 perspective. It was, I guess I shouldn't be shocked, but I sort of was that like, you can't go through that area and have it be so incredibly white.
I also thought about what if Thelma and Louise were black? I want to see a Thelma and Louise remake with two black women. I mean, I want to see what the choices that filmmakers and writers would make with that storyline. I mean, we know probably they'd be dead a lot sooner, right? They wouldn't make it to New Mexico.
I have an alternate idea that just popped in my head, which I don't know how much water holds, but I'm gonna float it out there that might kind of speak to a little bit of that, though, right? We all understand that Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, these places are places that feature tons of people who are not white, right? And Thelma and Louise both go to spaces that we see, at least on camera, that are exclusively white, right? And I'm kind of wondering if this might make sense that despite all the peril that they are in, that they are in a moment of flight, they continue to flee to white spaces along the way versus, say, going into Latina communities or Native communities or anything else like that. I kind of wonder if maybe that I kind of doubt that was a conscious decision, but I wonder if that might help to explain part of that.
I mean, it's a good theory. It's an optimistic theory, Jason. Yeah, right. But I also think, though, it's very indicative, and we've been talking about like 1990s feminism, right? But I think it's also very indicative of the in general, very sort of white space that white feminists created in the 1990s that was very distinctively white on purpose, right? You do get a little bit of multiculturalism in the 1990s, but it's certainly, not intersectional, not sort of engaging with the thriving Black feminist movement that's happening at the same time. It's just very siloed. And I think the movie itself is very siloed into white feminism.
Yeah. I mean, I think stories that were written in this period kind of draw on storylines that women of color historically were true, that were happening to them, right? So like in like The Handmaid's Tale, like all of the things that Margaret Atwood writes about that shocked white feminists, that continue. I mean, that's like why women today like still put on the red cloaks and like the white bonnets, right? And go protest down at their state legislature. That's a very white thing to do because what Atwood only later acknowledged, I think, and I don't think that acknowledgement has necessarily reached a lot of the audience of and readers of The Handmaid's Tale, but those were things that happened to women of color, enslaved women, rape, sterilization, forced birth, all of those things. And I think that one of the reasons that Thelma and Louise probably did resonate with like a lot of white feminists is like they were, and it's not to say that women of all races and classes do not experience sexual violence, like they do, right? We know this. And yet it's at the same time, like I think the film is so shocking, and it probably was so shocking in 1991 because it was like these two like nice looking white women, young white women. And so like, could they have made Thelma and Louise with two women of color at the center in 1991? I don't think so. I mean, I think it would have been a very difficult sell for audiences at the time. Today, though, I think there would be a big audience for that. And I would love to see a remake with like Octavia Spencer, and I mean, I just think it would be great. And we're seeing some of that now with, some of the films that have come out recently that feature Black women at the center. But yeah, it's both a meta commentary on where feminism was in the 90s. And also I think that the way a lot of like white women just like kind of saw themselves in the 90s, like siloed, like in their own space.
I want to switch gears if I can for a moment and think about other things outside of Thelma and Louise. We've been talking about the representation of feminism, the West, the female gaze. I'm kind of wondering if maybe you might be able to fill us in a little bit about other books or other films that you think about that help to explain feminism in the early 90s or as it relates to your own work, and then maybe other and films as well, right? So what's a reading and watching list look like to build off of? What's the Thelma and Louise syllabus look like?
Oh man. And now I feel like I need to like pull up my readings from my women's history class.
No, I mean, I think I guess I would talk about books first, because I have a lot of films that I think I could throw out there. But thinking about some of the themes of Thelma and Louise, and certainly we've been talking a lot about sexual violence. I think one of the most important books to come out, I can't remember the year it came out, but it wasn't too long ago. I don't know. I mean, in grad school, I know it came out, is Estelle Friedman's Redefining Rape, Sexual Violence in the Era of Suffrage and Segregation. It's such an important book for me when it came out when I was doing my grad studies, because it's really sort of about, I mean, it doesn't take place in the Thelma and Louise era, but it's really, I think it's like late 19th, early 20th century. We think we're sort of, at the height of racial segregation and sort of like women's suffrage era. And it's a time where, what she does is really sort of explore how women's rights supporters and African-American activists try to sort of expand their understandings of rape in order to, and like sexual violence to get legal protection. And I think that's a really important book that would sort of give us a historical understanding of rape and sexual violence, but also give us a very deep understanding of sort of racial differences that I think, Thelma and Louise doesn't have. That would be my first book. And so thinking about maybe other themes in the book, I was thinking a lot about the Gina Davis character and being sort of this housewife that's caught in this loveless marriage, and, that it's not what, being a housewife and sort of like we think of like 1950s June Cleaver kind of situation, right?
I thought of Elaine Tyler May's work and Stephanie Kuntz's work.
So I was going to say Stephanie Kuntz, right? Like The Way We Never Were, American Families and the Nostalgia Trap, right? She's a sociologist, but like I think she's super widely read among women's historians of women and gender, right?
Yeah, I mean, they both expose this narrative of like the 1950s marriage. I mean, of course, this is taking place 40 years later, but like, again, is 1991 functionally that different than 81 or 61? Or, I mean, yes, in some ways and no in others, right? Clearly, Thelma and Louise is giving us a situation in which like that particular relationship between Thelma and her husband could absolutely take place in the 50s or 60s, right?
Yeah, she definitely has the problem with no name, right? Like,
yes,
little
yep.
Betty Friedan in there, right?
Yeah, yeah.
I was trying to also think about, I identify as a historian of medicine, but I'm also trained as an American West historian. And, I was trying to think about what sorts of books or studies about women in the West that might resonate with folks who, are really on board with this whole, Thelma and Louise as a Western. And I mean, there are a lot of different choices. I mean, one of the problems that you run into very quickly when you're studying women in the American West is that you'll find that most of them are like sassy pioneers on the frontier, right? Like there's this whole genre of books that are just terrible, like it's really bad.
Yep.
But there's actually a really wonderful book called Women Writers of the American West. And it's a study of women who actually wrote about the American West between like early 19th century all the way up into like the 1920s. And it's just a really wonderful, fascinating study that was written by Nina Baum, who is an English professor. It's sort of like looking at, women were writing about and thinking about the West too, just as men were, right? But in sometimes different ways, right? And her study sort of looks at, these Western dime novels that were written by women, the ways in which women wrote about other women characters in the American West. It's sort of a little delightful little study that I would recommend. It's been foundational in me sort of thinking about how women were thinking about the West at the turn of the century.
I also thought about, if we were going to have a kind of a broad-based Thelma and Louise syllabus, I wrote down Margaret Jacobs' White Mother to a Dark Race.
Yes.
Because I think that somebody who didn't know anything about women's history or the history of the American West would watch Thelma and Louise, and they might be able to pick up on some of this stuff, but like they wouldn't get the full picture. And I think somebody like Jacobs writes about that much fuller picture where white women, in Thelma and Louise, white women are, they're the heroes and the victims at the same time, as we've just been talking about. But in White Mother to a Dark Race, as Jacobs shows us, white women are the perpetrators of violence. They are like the origin of the state institutionalization of particularly Native American children and people who were deemed mentally ill or incompetent. And of course, and she kind of globalizes the narrative because she also talks about white women in Australia who are doing the same thing with the Aboriginal population there. And I think a syllabus on Thelma and Louise would not be complete without showing kind of like the other side, like here's two white women where things are happening to them and the responses that they have. And it's very important and very like a very critical commentary on things. But then also like, let's think about white women's role in the West and the perpetuation of white supremacy and whiteness, and the kind of the global perpetuation of that, right, throughout this like set of like English speaking imperial countries like Australia, Canada, Great Britain, etc.
Yes, and stay tuned for my book, which is also going to look at white women physicians' complicity and sort of creating this sort of reproductive surveillance system in the American West that was really, looking at how to sort of, incarcerate, rehabilitate, and punish women of color over their reproductive autonomy.
I also thought about Danielle McGuire's At the Dark End of the Street, which is not about the American West, but it could be included on a Thelma and Louise syllabus because, if you're going to talk about the problem of rape and sexual violence, which that's what this movie is about in so many ways, people like McGuire and Friedman kind of highlight the ways that sexual violence has been like central to Black women's experience since the founding of the country. And so again, it's like it kind of reveals that division in 90s feminism and even today, right, where like white women are sort of just like waking up like, oh, all these bad things that are happening to us, like they're like, oh, those things were happening to other women who are not white for generations and generations.
Lauren, I'm so glad you said that too, because I kind of had a similar idea when I was thinking about films that I would include like in like a Thelma and Louise syllabus. And it's also sort of thinking back to like, my positionality as a high schooler in 1991 or just like how I was brought up sort of in that bubble of white feminism. Because when I was young, I think my mom was like really political. And so I have several films that I can recall that I watched in the 1980s and 90s that were very political and had strong like women characters in them. And so I'm talking about films like Silkwood, Norma Ray, 9 to 5, Coal Miner's Daughter, right? Like all of these films that are sort of like based on true stories of strong women who like were like fighting for unions or fighting against, sexism in the workplace or, all of these things. And I just grew up with these films and they were so sort of foundational to my eventual liberal commie college professor kind of, persona. Right. But I think if like, those aren't like necessarily, those are all films about like, strong white women doing things to make a difference. And they're not necessarily like the films that I would show exclusively to a class if I were teaching a class like this. Right. So one of the films that I've been thinking about, actually, there are two films that I've been thinking about that I've assigned in the past. And one was in 1990, what was also made in 1991, but I never saw until I was in grad school. And that's Daughters of the Dust. I don't know if you've seen that film.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
We showed it on HAPM.
Yeah. Also made in 1991.
Great film.
And such an important film that, again, I've shown in my classes before, but, I never saw it until I was in grad school. And then the other film that's a much earlier film, I don't know if you've ever seen the film Salt of the Earth. It's a 1954 film. And it's also based on a true story. It's about the Empire Zinc Strike of 1951, 1952 that took place in New Mexico. So also sort of centered in the American West. And it's mainly about striking miners. And there's like a protagonist who's a woman, a Mexican-American woman. And so she's fighting not only for like economic justice, but also like racial and gender justice. And this was made in 1954, right? So like there are these really amazing films out there that I think, for me, again, in my sort of white feminism 1990s bubble, never saw. And they're so important. I think it should be, like, if I were teaching this as a syllabus, I would definitely assign all of those films.
Well, I guess let me bring this all the way back then to our final kind of question then, which is Thelma and Louise a history movie?
I wrote down yes to that, but I wrote it down as it's like a meta a meta commentary, like we said, on 90s feminism. And I mean, I think that even if you're not watching it for that, there's also so many moments that would never happen in a 2022 film, like listening to the Walkman or like taking the phone into the other room and stretching the cord out, right, so that she can talk on, so she can hear Thelma on the other line. I mean, so there are like little moments where it's like a film about the history of technology and automobiles and country music, like, because I mean, bringing it back to your question about music, like late 80s country had a very interesting like moment with like a lot of women at the center of it, right? Like Carlene Carter and Tammy Wynette and these other people that were singing kind of these like very subversive songs in like the late 80s. And you can see how they're paving the way for like Martina McBride and Faith Hill and Mindy McCready and like these other kind of mid 90s country stars. And then we can see how that paved the way for the backlash where we have all the bro country of like the early to mid 2000s and I guess even late 2000s. So yeah, I mean, I think there's these moments that capture late 80s, early 90s culture in a very specific way. So I would say it is a history movie.
Yeah, I would definitely say it's a history movie. You know, it's not a historical film in terms of like, it's not, you know, depicting a particular period of time like we would think of like, I don't know, like the movie Elizabeth or something like that, right? But I would feel very comfortable in showing this film in like a women's history course. Because again, so to getting back to this conversation about, well, not only is it, I think it's a pretty good commentary on class and gender and whiteness in the 90s, getting back to our early conversation about the Me Too movement, right? That it's important for college students and up and coming college students and high school students to sort of understand that these moments don't come out of nowhere, right? That these histories have these things that happen, sexual violence, rape, domestic violence, these things have a history. And I could definitely see this playing a good sort of, a good example of how, these things have been depicted in pop culture and how they, have been around perhaps longer than college students are thinking.
I'm scheduled to teach women's history next fall. And I would never, like I said at the beginning of the podcast, I, hadn't seen Thelma and Louise in years and years and years. And I had never thought about it as, something to include in my class, but I am definitely going to include, I think I'm going to end the class now with Thelma and Louise, and maybe I'll assign this podcast as their homework.
Then our mission here is done tonight then. So we have students have not yet known this yet, but their lives are going to be radically transformed by the viewing of Thelma and Louise. And I'll tell you what, like I said earlier, I hadn't watched this film in its entirety. I don't think ever. And then this gave me the perfect opportunity to go and watch it. And I'm so glad I did.
Me too. What a gut punch.
Listening to the two of you.
I can't wait to hear students unpack it too, because I'm sure they'll bring perspectives to it that Jackie and I are missing, because we're a lot older than they are. So,
Jackie, Lauren, thank you so very much for being here tonight. I cannot thank you enough for taking the time to sit down and talk to me about this.
This was so fun.
This is a blast.
And I'm just so glad I finally got to see you or meet you in person.
This is close enough.
Yeah.
Right?
And then Jackie, it was so good to see you.
It's nice to see you too.
On the camera, not on Slack.
Everybody else, you can't see us, but we're looking at you from across the internet.
That's right.
And that's a wrap here at Historians of the Movies. Thank you so much to our guests, Lauren Thompson and Jacqueline Antonovich. Thank you, of course, to our producer, the only guy I would get in a car and drive off the cliff of the Grand Canyon with, Fletcher Powell. Historians of Movies was created by me, Jason Herbert, and you can find us on Twitter through hashtag HATM. And of course, this Sunday, we're actually doing a twofer here. We're actually going to be watching Thelma and Louise. It's going to be on Amazon Prime. Tune in at 8 p.m. Eastern. Follow me at Herbert History. Follow hashtag HATM. And you'll be able to actually tweet along with all of us at the exact same time based off this conversation you just had. And please do like and subscribe this podcast wherever it is you listen, and share this with your friends. We're trying to build a movement here, and it means so much to us. Give us some feedback. Tell us what you like. Tell us what movies you want to hear us talk about. And thank you so much for coming in, and we'll see you guys next time. Bye.